and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the entheogen and the emergency department, which I spent about 4 months looking into after a conversation with Jonathan. And my findings are very surprising to me, and I suspect they might be a little bit surprising to you as well. You probably know a few doctors, and essentially we're geeks and nerds, and so I'm going to talk about Star Trek. The entheogens are, in fact, as a series of drugs, about as spooky and scary as the science fiction drugs of Star Trek to the medical profession. We don't know a great deal about them as a profession, and those of you who've got into a little bit of medical trouble perhaps and have gone to seek medical help have probably been utterly dismayed at how little we know about it and how you've been treated, and that's utterly our fault. This is a paper from 1999, one of those papers that I wish I'd written about the total of number of poisonings that existed in the era of Star Trek. This is one Mudd's Women, with a wonderful toxin that made everybody who took it look ravishingly attractive, one that clearly we're depriving from Bronwyn Bishop. And here's quite a classic from the episode The City on the Edge of Forever. Cordrazine overdose. You'll notice in close-up the diaphoresis, which is sweating, the pupils, and the look of alarm. And that's the way my profession tends to look at these exotic overdoses. We're terrified. In fact, you're more likely to see a doctor look like this if you turn up at our emergency room. So, there are bits and pieces that I'm going to touch on, and this is a bit of an overview. There are problems with researching this from a medical and a scientific perspective. Lots of problems, and I'll tell you a little bit about why it's very difficult to research this. I'm going to go through a lot of what has already been touched on today, so I can go through that quite quickly, and you can get to bed quite quickly as well. We're going to look at what sort of data, like real data, not legal data, not political data, but real scientific and medical data is out there that supports some of the theories and some of the hypotheses that these are actually dangerous drugs. And some of you have been kind enough to allow me into your lives and tell me a little bit about you. For those of you who are here, who answered our survey, I'm truly grateful. And as part of that gratitude, I'm going to share with you some of the results of that. And then maybe if we have time and not everybody's asleep, we could talk a little bit about how we might collaborate together in getting rational drugs policy on these agents. So first of all, a list of apologies. I couldn't possibly do an exhaustive list of all the entheogens, so I've been very selfish in choosing the ones that I find interesting. I've also limited it to some of the more perhaps toxicologically interesting species, because many of these products aren't in fact dangerous at all. And there's no point in me telling you that because you already know it. So I'm going to look at the things that potentially are dangerous to you. And I'm going to limit myself to those pieces of information that are published in what's called the peer review literature. So basically, it's not government reports, it's not stuff that's been politically motivated, but it's been stuff that's been sent to a journal for publication, and it's been sent out again to other specialists to look at to see whether it's crap or not crap. So there is a bit of rigor involved in the peer-reviewed literature. Many of the substances that you are so familiar with just don't figure at all in any of the journals anywhere, which is why they're so scary to us. So, into problems. There's certainly problems of terminology. There are a gajillion different terms for the sort of things that we're talking about. From old terms like psychodyspeptic and psychotogenic, products that create psychosis, to newer terms like hallucinogenic. I was surprised that a lot of these terms like hallucinogenic, psychotomimetic, and psychedelic are actually fairly recent terms. I would have thought that they were sort of maybe 19th century terms, but no, quite recent. Entheogenesis and entheogenics is also recent. My favorite at the moment, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware of it, is a term called psychoheuristic. And if you consider a heuristic as an algorithm or a tool, a psychoheuristic is a tool for us to look at the human mind. And this may in fact be a very good term that we can both use, us from a medical perspective, looking at the way the mind works, and you, from a consumer perspective, at looking at how to expand the mind. It's not a term that is ruled out by either side of the equation. Internet access and the use of the internet in the drugs sort of culture is a very problematic thing. It can be incredibly useful. It can also be very destructive. It can be used as an excuse by politicians and legislators to legislate in a way that is inappropriate. It can be dangerous. The information out there can be very wrong. I've had online experiences speaking to people who are actively seeking the serotonergic syndrome, which is a dangerous thing to do. I'm no botanist, and even half an hour chatting to Michael is bewildering to me. These plants change their name. They're subdivided, redivided, redefined. And of course, now that these plants are being analyzed in a genetic way, it's all up for grabs again. So actually working out which of the more exotic plants are causing which of the symptoms can be very difficult. As a group, consumers are an incredibly elusive group. And perhaps that's well-reasoned. Listening to the issues of activism in psychotropics this morning, I would say it all sounded a little bit paranoid. But just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people aren't out to arrest you. So I think the paranoia that you express, to a certain degree, I agree with many of the panelists this morning, it's probably well-founded. And that paranoia, unfortunately, extends to when you get yourself in harm's way. When you overdose, it can be quite difficult for us as doctors to find out what's actually happened because you're afraid that we're going to tell somebody who doesn't need to know. And that's, I suppose, in a traditional way, a very real concern. I know doctors who would report overdoses. I think my generation of medical professions feel such animosity towards law enforcement that they would probably encourage greater use rather than reporting it to anyone. Thank you. When somebody comes to hospital, for the purposes of recording their presence or absence, we like to put a code on them. Not a barcode, but some sort of signifier as to what they've come to hospital with. So supposing you've perhaps overindulged in your favorite psilocybe, and you are reporting a sensation of palpitations, of a rapidly beating heart. That's going to be the primary diagnosis on your sheet of paper. And so we'll have no idea that that was in fact related to a plant ingestion. So the data is very skewed. There's no very good coding system at all. And those of you who are interested or knowledgeable about these things, the International Classification of Disease, the ICD coding of illicit drug use or any drug use is appalling. There's absolutely no sort of consistency in how these things are coded. It can be very difficult if people are being killed by these substances to find any evidence. It's difficult to look for it. You have to think of it. So we don't know if we're just missing things. The majority, unfortunately, of people who get into trouble using drugs are polysubstance users. Those people who show a little bit of reserve, a little bit of hang back and let's see how this works, tend not to get into trouble. The people who go out and binge heavy and roll 10 pills in a night and then top it off with a whole blotter sheet of acid and maybe half a kilo of coke, they're the people who I end up having to treat. And of course, there are lots of people who are very happy to say that they're in hospital and in the intensive care unit because of the one mushroom they took. We as a medical profession are profoundly unaware of what I would describe as the non-classical drugs. So coke overdose, very straightforward, very easy. Heroin overdose, similarly. But these sort of new products that are coming in the market, those that you have so much experience with as a group, we got no idea. There's this strange spectrum, and most doctors really have no idea, once again, of where these products lie. And indeed, I would say many lawyers have got no idea between the use of these products for medicine, as a health food, as a drug, all the way down into illicit use. And this is a fluctuating thing. And there are legal implications for us, for example, in terms of what we can and can't report. To me, in the medical profession, patient confidentiality is sacred. There's, as I say, thousands of these things floating out there, some of them natural, some of them synthetic. And it's clearly an area that not just specialized communities such as your own are interested in. This is clearly something, to my research, which is something that's filtering out into the wider community at large. There are very interesting formulations out there. As some of you may know, that I'm a strong advocate of pill testing. A lot of my work has been with the rave community. This is a very interesting pill that bothered us for quite some time, only in the difficulty in finding out what it was. This is the Bermuda Triangle, came in different colors, different formulations. But it took us about 18 months to actually work out that there was, in fact, LSD in it. Because it wasn't the slightest thing that we were looking for. It was something that we just never occurred to us that might be out there. LSD traditionally comes in blotters or little microdots, never in pills. And you know, if you listen to my colleagues from the States and from Europe who are into this sort of analysis, they were surprised. And so the Australian community clearly has an interest in cross use of drugs, manipulating drugs in ways that many people abroad don't do. So this is something, I'm very interested in these new products as they come out. I think there are medicinal benefits perhaps associated with them. And if they're dangerous, I think the consumer population needs to know if they're dangerous, why they're dangerous, and then if they have a little bit of knowledge, then they can make up their own minds. So far be it from me to tell them what to do. So this is a good model now of how new drugs come on a market. Initially, somewhere, there is an initiation point. For example, if I was to go back sort of 1985 through 88 to Ibiza, I would be able to chat with Paul Oakenfold and a wide variety of young pop upstart DJs who experienced MDMA or ecstasy for the first time. And we would know all about it long before people find out that their children are using it age 12 in Australia. You know, this is something that I think is a good idea. I think a lot of these substances are perfectly reasonable for adults to use. Maybe should be avoided by people who are not yet shaving. And so you have wise and people who are, you know, at the forefront of trends. These are your trendsetters. And very frequently, new drug use happens in a very isolated area. I went back to a nightclub, or an ex-nightclub in London this year. Those of you may have heard of it, it's called Shoom. And Shoom was the first place in all of the UK where MDMA was used in any sort of way at all. And it's a sort of a researcher's dream to find these little focuses and chat to people about these products right early on so we can get a good understanding of what's happening and of course, form a sort of a union, a collaboration, if you like, early on. But no, that didn't happen, unfortunately. And so what you had was you had MDMA diffused out around the community by these sad and sorry little feckers who were desperately eager to become part of this trendy group. And it was these little bastards who screwed it up for everyone by overdosing and not using it responsibly. And of course, you know, this was used as an excuse by authorities in an incredible story. I don't have time to chat about it, but the way in which MDMA was scheduled in the United States was a farce and a joke. And in fact, if the medical profession had had their way, it would have been a Schedule III drug and would have been a medicine, and there wouldn't have been all the fuss that there is about it now. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. But if we as a profession want to get to know new substances, talk about potential therapeutic alliances and whatnot, we need to crack on in here and chat to people like you. So there's lots of different sources. I don't need to tell you that, and we've already chatted about that. And the use of entheogens is old as culture itself. This is from the Pecos River, which is some sort of glyphs 2,000 years before the Christian era, showing people using Jimsonweed. What sort of things are people interested in now? Well, this is from a classification from 1991 from the Dutch smart shops. And they found or identified 31 types of substances in 4 groups: energizers, relaxing herbs, aphrodisiacs, and hallucinogens. I've put nitrous and GHB in there because I don't really consider them particularly botanical. Where else can we find data? Well, if we look at, say, data from poison centres. These are centres all around the world which track phone calls from concerned professionals about various types of overdoses. The USA, the Toxic Exposure Surveillance System, is a massive undertaking. As Dennis has alluded to, these sort of studies cost shitloads of money. But between 1983 and 2000, nearly 30 million reports were made. There were 10,000 deaths, and only 30 plant-related deaths. 5 were Datura related, and these were the ones that were most represented. But with all sort of respect to the data, I mean, if these were the odds of me getting cancer, I'd take them. Thank you. If you look at data from the Slovak Republic, 584 plant exposures between 1994 and 2003, 4% of all of the exposures. 20.5 of them, percent of them were recreational. And once again, Datura is the thing that keeps on coming up high. If you look at Spain, and this is in fact all of the data, there's no more data than I'm presenting here. This is all of the data that's available. If you look at Spain, a review of poison center consultation data over 13 years, the orange segment there, Datura. You may be seeing a theme coming out here. In Taiwan, 1,600 odd plant exposures, 83 of them anticholinergic, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Once again, Datura. Do I need to go on here? There's 5 nutmeg exposures in Germany, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. In Italy, just under 5,000 plant poisonings. And they looked at the non-mushroom, non-THC type hallucinogens. Ages ranging between 16 and 36. Datura, Argyria, Myrstica fragrans, salvia, interestingly, which is unusual, and Mandrake. And we'll talk about some of those. In our own hospital study, we're busy looking back at it at the moment to try to get some more detail because, once again, the coding has made it very difficult to identify. That we found in 10 years, 34 cases of plant ingestion. And when you consider that at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, we see just about 60,000 patients a year, we're not talking a huge number here. All of the people who went to intensive care, Datura. I thought this was interesting. There's not actually a lot of survey data out there because I rather assumed that when I started talking with you, when we started our dialogue, that I'd be able to compare what you were telling me about who you are and what you do to other people. And of course, that's not the case. You are this incredibly interesting, ecologically conserved niche of consumers that nobody has ever studied. Consider yourself guinea pigs. Yes, that's right. You're fascinating. This is a study from Denmark from 1992. High school students using psilocybin or psilocybin mushrooms, and the university students getting really stuck in there. So it's a plant, for Christ's sakes. How could it hurt you? You know, they're at the bottom of the food chain. Well, there's a number of ways that plants can hurt you. Intrinsic problems with the plant itself, so related to what you're about to consume. You can predict that if you eat an anticholinergic plant, you might, if you overdose on it, have anticholinergic symptoms. That's pretty predictable. It may interact with some of the other medications that you take. Many people who experiment in this way also use medications that can be quite problematic when used in combination. And then there are problems which really aren't the plant's fault. There are people going on a mushroom hunt when they're still off tap and deciding to eat poisonous mushrooms. There are clear variations in strains and strengths of product. Unfortunately, we know for a fact that in the purchasable products, there do occur incidences of contamination, substitution, and adulteration. For example, that's very clear in the Chinese alternative medical system. You know, you don't have to buy a lead-painted toy to get sick from Chinese products. And then, of course, there's the whole inappropriate labeling and advertising side of things. So this is an interesting plant. I thought I might start, but for no particular reason. Actually, no, there is a particular reason. I'll start with this. Catha edulis. And as I say, I'm not a botanist, so I'm not going to dwell very much on a lot of the botanical bits and pieces. As you're probably aware, there's been a huge furore about the role and the behaviour of certain ethnic groups in Australia. I think that was greatly overstated. What I think what's very interesting about some of these ethnic groups is that they are continuing the use of their traditional products while they're in Australia. That may in turn see some more problems associated with this plant in Australia. It's a very widespread habit, the use of khat in the Horn of Africa, and it's been likened to nothing more or less than drinking coffee, as a light buzz or a social lubricant. And in fact, it's one of the widely used drugs in the world. Over 10 million people are chewing it, probably as we speak. And that it's also up to 80% of the adult population of Somalia and Yemen. And it contains cathinone. It's a stimulant with quite a similarity to amphetamines and ephedrins. Now, did that thieving gypsy? No, he left it here. Good. And you can see that there. The structure here, very similar. And people have been keen for, I suspect, political reasons to link it to disease. And so its abuse has been linked to hypomanic or manic presentations. So it's like, you know, I've had 7,000 cups of coffee and I want to talk. In their more profound state, it can lead to a paranoid state. And it can lead to anorexia and insomnia. Well, go figure. It's the same structure. Who would have thought? But 25% of the psychoses actually respond to simple abstinence. This thing's making you unwell? Stop using it. Oh, cheers. And the rest of them can be treated very simply with antipsychotic medication. If you are one of these people who has problems with this particular plant product, if you go back and chew it again, you're likely to get the same problems. There you go now. Somebody pays me thousands of dollars to come to these conclusions. And I think one of the things that we need to take into account, if we're going to start making judgments about our poor, unfortunate refugee community in this country, God knows they need as much sympathy for being in this country alone. There's probably things associated with what it's like being a refugee in Australia that drives them to mental illness than the actual products that they're using. It is very hard being a refugee in Australia. Australia can be a very racist country, and I think it's very difficult to isolate the product away from the way these people are treated. So I think there's a combination of factors that may be leading to an overprevalence in this community. There is one case of neurological impairment or stroke, and it's been associated in a temporal way. So people who use khat tend to have heart attacks at different times of the day. They don't necessarily have a greater or an increased frequency, but they tend to have their heart attacks at different times. The relevance of that, I don't know. Here's an interesting drug. This is the synthetic equivalent, and this is something that I think may become more prevalent. The thing that I think is very interesting about this, and you can see that's the cathinone, and this is the methcathinone. It relies exclusively on an oxidative synthesis. Now, those clever little chemists out among you will know that many of the products that are restricted for synthesis are in fact restricted for reductive processes. So those of you who are interested in those sort of things, and none of these issues are actually watched or under control. Look, this is my treat for you this evening. You are going to be the first people in the world to know what are in these products. You're probably aware of, there's been some interest on a number of bulletin boards around the world on these products produced by neo-organics. These are Spirit, Neodove, Subcoca, marketed as legal entities. We've been running a little survey on blue light to get some information on what their effects might be. And as I say, there's been quite a lot of speculation as to what's in them. And there they are. Methamphetamine, this one here, which has been used as a dietary supplement in the past. 4-methyl methcathinone, and methcathinone itself. There's also another product that's never been described, one with a thaliamido grouping. Those of you who are interested or concerned, these are potentially hazardous to your health, and also potentially legally problematic for you. Nutmeg, a delightful spice used in the production of eggnog. Ancient, and has been used, I wouldn't say psychotherapeutically, but psychohallucinogenically for generations, millennia probably. The more contemporary use was reported by the ubiquitous Alexander Shulgin. But the first poisoning that I can find any sign of was reported in 1576. So it's been known to be active for ages. And you can basically divide the constituents into terpenic fractions. I'm not going to get into the chemistry for you. But perhaps more interestingly, into the sort of aromatic or phenolic fractions. And this compound, myrcene, a bit cut off there, is probably the most interesting component as far as overdose is concerned. That's a calcium antagonist, among other things. And calcium antagonists are bad for the heart. They have a tendency to change the heart rate, so they have a chronotropic effect, and change how well the heart pumps. So they have an ionotropic effect as well. They're certainly hallucinogenically active, but the concern for us is that if they're taken in biblical quantities, so if you eat more than the volume of your head, you run the risk of getting some serious cardiovascular effects. Oh, please don't be so polite. I'm a Republican. Go ahead, yes. I've been in correspondence with Professor Shulgin regarding PMA quite extensively. I have both of his books. Synthetically, I don't think I'm bright enough to follow it. So, I'd be prepared to be corrected if I'm using the wrong terminology. I'm hoping you're not finding it overly offensive.
No, I don't assume to correct you, but can you speak about the differentiation between the two?
Sorry, between?
Between hallucinations and visual distortions.
I wouldn't know how to technically differentiate it, but I think a hallucination from a medical perspective is, if you go down the lines of psychosis, a psychosis is an impairment of one's sense of reality, frequently involving hallucinations. They can be visual or auditory, where one's sense of perception and one's insight into that is disturbed. A visual disturbance is one where you're sitting there going, fuck me, can't see this right, why is everything blue? But you still know that everything is blue, and it may not make sense, but you know that there's something wrong. That would be my just layman's interpretation. It's not necessarily, God forbid that I get Alexander in any problems or trouble there.
No, but what amuses me, or frightens me perhaps, is that someone like yourself might be trying to put a law one day to colour with your language and your perception of the differentiation between the two.
Oh, well, I frequently do. You be worried. I'm often in the court of law.
And I'm amused also.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. No, I try not to put values on the substances I describe, and I think that's one of the.
Sometimes people's private lives and public lives are at stake.
Oh, I completely agree, including my own. Yeah, no, I absolutely understand that. But we can only work off the framework of our own education. Perhaps all of us don't have the sort of insight or time to wade through both of those volumes and quote them verbatim. I know, I wish I did have that sort of memory. So back to this anyway. Look, I will sit down and we'll chat about it more. Honestly, you'll distract me. I'll go on like, what's his face? Dennis, where's he gone? You'll be here tomorrow. So one of the commonest effects, I've only treated one of these, and believe me, I'm like some sort of laser-guided bomb when it comes to overdoses. I can smell them a mile away. And despite me looking for them everywhere, I've only ever treated one nutmeg abuse, and basically, I have seen nutmeg abused in a culinary way.
basically, the young lady that I treated was very nervous, very agitated, and a little bit paranoid, and nothing that a good solid dose of a benzodiazepine didn't cure. And she had a nice little sleep, and she was fine. So, the active dose in terms of hallucination is quoted as being 15 to 20 grams, which is loads, I think. You can detect it in the blood, and deaths have been reported. There's one case of a fatality in a 55-year-old woman who either loved her eggnog or... No, that's not true. I happen to know that she actually packaged up, like, this enormous quantity of nutmeg into gelatin capsules and just necked them all down. There's no description as to whether it was actually... Because, of course, people do commit suicide with hallucinogenic products. There's no description as to whether this was an attempt to commit suicide or attempt to get really smashed. So why aren't we seeing everybody smelling fragrantly and off their taps well, it's pretty fucking awful to taste. If you want to get a good high, there's plenty of other things you can do better. It's actually not a particularly good hallucinogen, but it's easy to obtain. And of course, the people who tend to use it and get sick are the 14 to 16-year-olds who have got no idea how to score drugs any other way. This is an interesting family. These are commonly known the convolvulaceae, which is kind of an erotic name in my mind. Often known as the morning glory, made up of over 2,500 species and 80 genera. And of course known most as morning glory. The sort of important entheogenic genera are the Ipomea, the Argyria, and the Revia species. But I'm happy to be corrected. I'm sure you have discovered thousands more that you can use with a gay abandon. It's been reported widely, the use in the New World. And I don't think we need to touch on it very much in that sense. It kind of re-emerged, I suppose, certainly in the medical literature in the 1960s, and there were isolated case reports. Really, people just hallucinating and not really getting incredibly sick. And this contains a compound, the lysergic acid ammonite, or also known as ergine. And you can see the structural relationship to LSD. So hardly surprising that it's going to be psychoactive. And this, I think, is a very good plant to use as a representative of some of the potential problems that are associated with the psychohallucinogens. The problems are that it's not actually that easy to hurt yourself from a toxicological perspective. So it's actually quite difficult to poison yourself. But when you're driving at 150 kilometers an hour to escape the giant bat sitting on your head, you can hurt yourself. And the behavioral side of things is what I think gets most people into problems. So one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later is what you guys do to avoid getting into those problems, and the use of sober sitters, for example, brilliant idea. If you have somebody to mind you, you're less likely to get behind the wheel of a car when something bad is happening to you psychologically. So there's several reports of psychosis from Denmark, an obsessive neurosis lasting 1.5 years, and basically they plugged them into a car battery and then fed them morning glory, and every time they reported a good effect, they gave them a shock. Very hard to get ethical approval to do that sort of therapy these days. And there's increasing reports of the use of these sort of products. The Hawaiian baby wood rose was reported to be increasing in 1983. And there is a steady increase in reports regarding psychosis associated with this use. You have to be very careful about interpreting this sort of literature. There are definite benefits for people to report adverse side effects to illicit drugs because it generates finance and money to research these products, because that's what governments like to hear. I would commend you. I may not have read the technology section of Alexander, but I commend you to his little article, Cui Bono, which is who benefits from the war on drugs. And if you are prepared to stand up and say that all drugs are bad, and you're going to hell if you use them, someone's going to give you a lot of money to keep saying that. And I think that what we're seeing is a reporting bias here, rather than an increase, a real increase in psychosis. So the tissue toxicological side of things, so when you look at, does it poison the liver, does it poison the heart, does it poison the lungs? It doesn't appear to, until you get into quite high doses. These are from animal studies. It may, in fact, cause fetal distress. We know for a fact that ergot and extracts of ergot we use all the time during the course of labor. And this is perhaps those of you who are enjoying your the latter years of your dating and courtship. You may, before you sign the final fateful contract, you may want to consider whether you would use this product if, for example, you might be pregnant, because there could be problems on that front. And also, there certainly is the potential for problems in conjunction with other medication as well. However, I think it's got plenty of potential also therapeutically. It could be used to treat morphine addicts. That was reported as long ago as 1966. And there is a possibility that it could be used along with the psilocybe species for the treatment of cluster headaches. You need to be aware, and I'm sure many of you are, that it is frequently treated to discourage consumption, but, plant it, grow it, and then eat it. It's not that difficult to get around. Here is my bugbear, I'm afraid, and I'll be very interested to hear the talk on Datura delirium tomorrow, because it's a fascinating entity, and it's about the only thing that, in terms of the entheogens, that gets my rocks off. It's a dangerous overdose, people die, and therefore it's exciting. It's one of the oldest and best medically described entheogens, and that's a reflection of its toxicity. People die and have been for ages. Numerous species are implicated, and for those of you who are interested, the alkaloid ratios differ between the species. And I suppose I've not read anything to that effect, but I suppose that would have different subjective effects according to which plants you're choosing to use. Like a lot of these products, there's extensive evidence of ancient use. And the term Jimsonweed comes from 1676 when, I'm not entirely sure if the British troops, having found out or discovered that they were British, decided to commit mass suicide, or in fact were poisoned. I'm not sure. Either way, as an Irishman, I applaud their use of it. There really isn't a lot in the medical literature until this resurgence of interest, which I think was a reflection of a broad resurgence of interest in the hallucinogens in the 1970s. In the sort of 1920s, 1930s, and also in the 19th century, it was associated with proprietary medications. So things for the treatment of asthma, things for the treatment of nocturnal incontinence. But it's always been present in complementary medicine. This is sort of a traditional use from an Afghan malang. It has been implicated as an agent that's been used to drug tourists or the unsuspecting. I'm sure somebody else brighter than me is going to talk about the various components. They are quite interesting, mind you. There are three major tropane alkaloids. Don't get me wrong, there's thousands or probably hundreds more, but scopolamine or hyoscyamine and atropine are the big guys that are very interesting. And they're competitive muscarinic antagonists. I'm going to explain all that. They block acetylcholine at a muscarinic receptor, but not at nicotinic sites. And the scopolamine and hyoscine cross the blood-brain barrier to have that sort of central delirium effect. So, yeah, you're not the only one that can do neurotransmitters. Watch this. This is the acetylcholine receptor. Very important in part of the autonomic nervous system. So this is the thing. This is the housekeeping section of the nervous system. And you can see that, normally speaking, acetylcholine is released and will bind to an acetylcholine receptor. That can be a muscarinic receptor or a nicotinic receptor. And then that signal is terminated by an enzyme which splits off the acetate from the choline. It's called acetylcholinesterase. So if you block the muscarinic receptor, you're going to have an anticholinergic crisis. You need this acetylcholine to keep things going on. And if you block it, well, you're going to be anticholinergic. Now, this is a very complicated slide. It's very late to be giving it to you, but I have faith in your ability to follow. So pay attention. What does this do to you? I have a simplification after this. It decreases the stimulation of various sweat glands in the skin, so it creates dry skin. It decreases the stimulation of glands in the mouth, so you get a dry mouth, and you become thirsty. And the body attempts to sort of modify the temperature, and you get this flush as the blood is transferred to the skin. It decreases your bladder tone, so you can frequently go into urinary retention. It changes the size of your pupils, and probably the reason for which it's taken, it causes a delirium centrally. Now, you don't have to remember all that nonsense, because there's something that will help you remember it. It's you become dry as a bone, hot as a hare, red as a beet, blind as a bat, and mad as a hen. A lot of people think that it's actually mad as a hatter. But of course, that's not the case. It's mad as a hen, because mad as a hatter refers to mercury poisoning, which the people who made hats, or milliners, used to suffer from you witness Alice in Wonderland. And that mnemonic, the earliest state that I can find, it is a classic for those of you who are involved in pharmacology. It comes from Morton in 1939. I'm told that it comes from an ancient Anglo-Saxon term, but I can't find any reference to that anywhere prior to 1939. To me, as a doctor, anticholinergic poisoning, along with serotonergic syndrome, is one of the most dangerous side effects of any drugs, never mind the entheogens. There are serious consequences to it, and those of us who aren't pathologically interested in overdoses can frequently miss the early signs. These alkaloids, which can do this, are actually pretty common in this larger family called the Solanaceae. So things like belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and the Datura brugmansia species. Very common to see overdoses from this entire group. So what sort of things does it do to you? Well, we've already discussed a lot of them. If, for example, you're merely picking it, and some of the sap gets in your eye, you can have a dilated pupil, or what used to be called a corn picker's pupil. The onset of the symptoms for oral ingestion occur within about 30 to 60 minutes. And unfortunately, because one of the side effects is to delay gastric emptying, those effects can be prolonged up to 24 hours. There's been nearly 500 cases reported between 1912 and 1991. This guy, Rob Lowe, obviously had nothing better to do and decided to count them all. And there have been several deaths, including mass fatalities. Most deaths are due to behavioral change, to the delirium component. But some people do get into problem from the autonomic side of things. It's been used forensically, so for drug-facilitated sexual assault, robbery, and even murder. And it's also contaminated herbal medicine in the past. Oh, that was a good picture. Hang on a second. How do I make it go back? There you go. There's somebody, I don't know if you can see that, but those are fucking dinner plates. Trying to get him to stay still to take that photo, you would not believe what I had to I just, we put a little line in him, and he had a rhino quantity of benzos after that. Interestingly, as a plant, there's frequently seasonal variation. So we have a botanic garden beside us at the Royal Adelaide Hospital. And as the Datura flowers, we get a phone call to warn us that Datura has flowered. And then within the next few weeks, we have, you're presumably aware of emos. The emos arrive in their droves, like psychotic cows with bits of Datura plant coming out of their mouth. Unfortunately, it's this group that gets into problem, and also the young as well. So the people who are trying, once again, to score product that will give them a high, turn to what I think is a very hardcore substance. I am prepared to accept that it is possible to use Datura in a enlightening way. But fuck me, you want to be careful about it. The delirium is not trivial. There was a case reported recently of a boy cutting off his tongue and his penis under the influence of this. So this is not Oh, goodness, it's just wild. This is very serious delirium. And as I said, there are clusters of presentations. The largest Australian series was by my good friend Jeff Isbister, who's a toxicologist in New South Wales. And they have a very good database. And they looked at all presentations in the database between 1990 and 2000. So that's 10 years of a database. Only 33 patients, most commonly ingested as tea. And of course, the commonest presentation was this delirium. No deaths in this series. The diagnosis is, if you're shrewd, quite just a clinical one, which means that we don't have to do any scans, blood tests, whatever. Just look at them and you're anticholinergic. In the most severe ones, we use a cholinergic agonist, a reversal agent, if you like, called physostigmine. And now, that used to be, everybody used to get it, but it's got its own problems. So these days, I'm a big fan of the people who are suffering psychosis. Generally speaking, they frequently don't want to be. And so I let them sleep through it. And to do that, I give them large doses of intravenous benzodiazepines, one called particularly midazolam. And they go night-night, everybody's happy. Unfortunately, a lot of the sedatives that we can use, phenothiazines, and people who don't know this, and there are medical people, lots of medical people who don't know this, can in fact exacerbate the problem. This is an intriguing plant, and Michael knows a lot more about it than me. Nicotine was identified as an ingredient of this drug as early as 1879. Now, I can see a lot of you are very keen fans of nicotine, and as adults, that's entirely appropriate. What you may not be aware of is that, for example, if you were to give one cigarette to a 2-year-old child and they ate it, there's enough nicotine in one cigarette for a 2-year-old child to kill 30% of the people who ate it. So it's a deadly toxin in a given dose. However, we can find no evidence at all of it actually hurting anybody, patchouli, your native hallucinogen. The other thing that I find intriguing as a foreigner is that there's not a lot of evidence at all for contemporary use. I know that it's being used in a contemporary way, but nobody has reported on it. So if any of those of you who are interested in talking to me about that, I'll be very interested to hear. There are only 4 papers that are published about it in our big search engine, which is called PubMed, and it's actually grown commercially for the production of tropane alkaloids. In terms of overdose, the 4 cases are reported by Boyd et al. In 1981. What's perhaps more interesting is that it's been reported as an antidote for ciguatera toxicity. That's a dinoflagellate red tide type poisoning. Pretty dangerous. People die from it. And off the west coast of Australia, people have used it as an antidote. So I found that interesting. I don't know if you do. Mandrake. Any of you seen Pan's Labyrinth? Cracking film. Yeah, best to see it sober, I would say. The young girl places a mandrake root under her mother's bed. This is a substance that's been invested in psychic interest and sort of the spiritual interest for donkey's years because of the appearance of the root and how close it is to, well, maybe Australian men, certainly not Irish men. It's not to be confused with the American mandrake, Podophyllum peltatum, which contains a toxin, but it's a very different toxin. And it contains, once again, tropane alkaloids. One thing, somebody may be able to help me, it's been reported to contain something called mandragorine, but I've not been able to find the structure of it. I don't know if that's sort of like, an imaginary invented compound, but maybe one of you could enlighten me later on in the evening. Very similar problems to Datura because of its anticholinergic properties. There have been deaths reported historically. First one that I could find was in 1903. It's cropped up with poisonings associated with herbal medication, injuries, so people behaving oddly and hurting themselves, and one case of mass poisoning.
Excuse me,
Hello.
David, you keep mentioning mass poisonings and all
Yes.
that.
So.
What are mass poisonings?
Oh, we're not talking about the death of a nation. I'm talking about, possibly anything between 10 to 23 people presenting within a 24-hour period having ingested from the same cup. Supposing somebody here decided we were going to sit down and eat mushrooms. It's dark, we couldn't find out what it was, and we decided to eat altogether Ammonite phalloides. Well, that would be a mass poisoning. So we're talking more than about 10 I don't recall seeing in any of the literature anything more than 22 as a mass poisoning, and not necessarily pitching up all at once, but associated with the same event or the same venue. So we're not talking about the Jamestown massacre or anything like that. And a lot of these people who become unwell, they become unwell through misidentification and confusion. And you can see that one of these plants, this one here, is Mandrake, and this one is borage, which is used both as a herb and as a medicinal. And they can be easily confused, and people can become unwell as a consequence of that confusion. This is a fairly local product, Piper methysticum, or the intoxicating pepper, indigenous to the Pacific. I have tried it, but I'm pretty sure that I tried it via the Fijian method. And it contains cavalactones. These are concentrated in the lateral roots, and there are at least 15 identified. And they act through GABAergic, gamma-aminobutyric acid receptors. These are sedative receptors.
Are you sure?
Am I sure that they're sedative receptors?
No, are you sure that they work through GABA?
Well, look, I mean, the people who have been reporting this report that it works through GABAergic receptors. They may work through other receptors as well.
Supposed to be MAOB and SNRI as
It
well.
may be active there as well. I'm prepared to accept that, but it's not reported in the medical literature as such. I will update the slide accordingly. In terms of what harm it can cause, the commonest side effect associated with its consumption is a dermopathy, so a disease of skin. And it's frequently associated with overconsumption. It will interact with other GABAergic compounds. It's probably a dangerous compound to use in conjunction with benzodiazepines, for example. There's increasing concern with what is described as a hepatotoxicity. And this has been reported in a number of cases, and indeed in a case series. And how it works, nobody really knows. There is speculation that it works in the same way, perhaps, as either paracetamol or halothane, that it causes an autoimmune hepatitis. But the mechanism of this is unknown. It's certainly well reported, but deaths associated with it are very rare indeed. I'm sure that we've covered acacia with gay abandon. What I do know from the survey results that you've been kind enough to send is that this is a very important product for this community. There are almost no reports of human poisoning. Those which occur are in children and also in livestock. The active ingredient, perhaps the best known one, among other alkaloids, is dimethyltryptamine. And really, I can't take any of the shine off Dennis's talk, so I'm not going to talk a lot about dimethyltryptamine. What I would point you to is a paper by Gables, who is looking at the index between toxicity and effect. And clearly, those products which are very close to being toxic in an active dose are those that you might construe as being dangerous. But in fact, this is not one of those products, and it's been compared to codeine or methadone in terms of its safety margin. Let's talk a little bit about mushrooms. First place that I've found the term magic mushroom was actually, it was, God knows, it happens frequently enough, coined by the press. This article in 1957, Wasson's experiences in seeking the magic mushroom, basically was the source of this term. Wasson himself allegedly didn't like the idea of that term at all. And there's a wide variety of products now of mushrooms that are out there that contain hallucinogenic products. A couple of terms. The religious use of these products is called mycolatry by some. Medically, we refer to illness associated with mushrooms as mycetism. And once again, as a botanical product, it has a seasonal variation. Why do people get sick from using mushrooms? They pick the wrong mushrooms. Some people try to hurt themselves. They're very good agents to kill yourself with if you want to. There are variations within the plants themselves, different concentrations of different products. And there does appear to be a certain degree of variation with the way people handle these products themselves. This is a classic, cartoon picture almost, but a photo of the fly agaric, an ancient mushroom. Well, of course it's ancient, it's evolutionary, it's ancient, but culturally an ancient mushroom. It's been used to kill flies. We could have used with some today, I'm sure. And it causes a very unusual toxidrome of tiredness and somnolence, and also agitation and hallucination. Usually these sort of things are not mixed in this way, and therefore this can be a very confusing overdose for the doctor. This is a graph of one of the described chronologies of an overdose. Get off you. So at about 30 minutes, there's reported a visual and auditory aesthesia, space and time distortion, and then potentially drowsiness and vivid dreaming. And it can go on for up to 8 hours. I'm quite suspicious about these sort of graphs in the medical literature because I suspect that, not having used this particular product, I suspect it's very subjective. But this is an attempt at generalizing its effects. And of course, Ammonite poisoning is well described. With muscaria, you can get anticholinergic symptoms, as we discussed, and the severity is, of course, proportional to the dose that you ingest. Prolonged psychoses have been reported, but generally speaking, no long-term sequelae have been reported with this or pantherina. There, once again, has been a cluster reported, so a mass poisoning, of 23 in the United States. Very interesting compounds involved. The isoxazoles perhaps are the most interesting one from the hallucinogenic perspective. From my perspective, I find the peptides fascinating. And people have looked at syndromes associated with mushroom poisoning. This is quite a decent paper of those of you who are interested in mushrooms, looking at over 28,000 cases and classifying them into 14 major syndromes. Misidentification is important in mushroom use. This is a poisonous mushroom, and it's a very poisonous mushroom. 90% of the lethal poisonings caused by mushrooms in Europe and North America are caused by this. And one of the sad things about it is it's like paracetamol overdose, is that you think you're getting better, where the reality is that your liver's failing. It goes through a series of stages, and unless somebody takes your condition seriously, you will be on a list for a liver transplant. It's frequently missed. For example, in one series of 7 overdoses, in 5 cases, patients went on to develop liver failure because it was missed, it wasn't considered. This is another dangerous product, and well, that's why it's called a destroying angel. And a series of deaths have been reported. One would have to say that you would probably have to be visually impaired, stupid, or off tap to confuse that with muscaria. Now, I think these are actually structurally beautiful compounds. They're deadly, but they're complex and very attractive in their chemical structure. And these are some of the hallucinogenic compounds, water-soluble. You'll excuse me for pushing on, but I realize that it's long past everyone's Betty Buys. And the effects are described as visual distortions, loss of equilibrium. I cannot find a good report of convulsions. It seems that it causes twitching, but convulsions to me are when you lose consciousness, and you, like with epilepsy, and it's not well described that way. So I would be reluctant to say that it causes convulsions. The non-phalloides and indeed non-muscaria ingestions can also be problematic. Perhaps the commonest one is renal failure following ingestion of Cortinarius. I think there's a very dodgy case report reporting demyelination, so stripping of myelin sheath from brain tissue following mushroom ingestion. I think that's quite a dodgy report. No mechanism is reported for that. What is quite pleasing to those of you who are interested in sort of I guess the symmetry of harm and treatment. The treatment these days is also a botanical product from milk thistle. And it's clear now that there are definite indications for using milk thistle in Ammonite poisoning. The liver failure, that should be mortality. If you suffer from liver failure from this product, or from mushrooms, there's a 30% mortality. So 1 in 3 of you will die. And you may well need a liver transplant. So, but I emphasize that that is from mistake alone. It's not from the hallucinogenic mushrooms. It's from ones which are known to be deadly and known to be fatal. I'll talk a little bit about psilocybe. I chatted to Dennis about this earlier on. This is psilocybe, marketed as psilocybe McKinney. But I could find no reference to it whatsoever, and he certainly hasn't endorsed it or produced it, and he's not getting any profit from it. And he tells me that it's a marketing ploy by Dutch producers. And this is what's or has been going on recently in Holland. The production of and consumption of live, fresh-grown mushrooms in a supervised way. Sadly, that era seems to be over. Or it's certainly threatened, as many of you will know. There's 2 happy punters. And the harm, such as it is, appears to be exclusively behavioral. And there have been a number of toxicological studies which suggest that you would actually have to eat your own weight in this product to be poisoned by it. And that requires a true dedication to the cause. There are numerous isolated case reports about people having hallucinations on hallucinogenic mushrooms. It's brilliant. Trees have died to print that sort of crap. And now, the most interesting research is in the use of these products, if you like, being rehabilitated as potential agents for therapy. There's a couple of others, which I've seen. I think I've seen a few of them today. And we've already had a little chat, really, about mescaline. It's the sort of potent standard against which all other phenethylamine bases are compared. This is a nice little diagram which explains the sort of, say, the nomenclature of mescaline, which is 3,4,5 trimethoxyphenylethylamine. And you can see that you've got the phenyl group, the ethylamine group, and the methyl groups or methoxy groups at the 3, 4, 5 positions. And that's why it's called what it's called. You can see also these interesting, I say intriguing similarities in structure between a couple of endogenous entities and those which are found in nature. Is it a coincidence? I don't know. I find it fascinating that these molecules are so close to what we're using. Maybe it seems obvious to you, but to me as a doctor, it's intriguing and almost divine in its similarity. You actually have to look damn long and damn hard to find evidence of harm, true harm from these entities. Some poor bastards were storing it in water and got botulism from the water. That's not really the problem with the cactus. Those of you who have used mescaline will be aware of the fact that it causes nausea, and one of the potential side effects of protracted vomiting is a tear to the esophagus, and that's a Mallory Weiss tear. So there's been a report of that. Prolonged psychosis? Well, possibly. Is it teratogenic? Does it hurt your chromosomes? I think there was a fad about reporting that, but I don't recall reading any strong evidence to support it. And certainly, if you're going to take any substance that renders you flat and comatose for a while, and usually that will be maybe mescaline with something else, you can stay flat and comatose so long that your muscles get bruised and release myoglobin, and you can poison your kidneys. And that's called rhabdomyolysis, but that's not the fault of the mushrooms either, or the cacti, I should say. The best study to date, I think, is by Halpern et al. In 2005, which shows no evidence of either cognitive or psychiatric deficit in the Native American church users. This is a proper scientific paper, and perhaps the only one in the literature that I've been able to access. Dare I talk about ayahuasca in the presence of so many people who know so much about it? Maybe just a bit. You know that it's an admixture of plants from the Amazon. I've stolen this picture from Dennis's paper. Once again, I find it, as a medical person, quite fascinating, this synergy of action. And Dennis and I were talking about it earlier on today. Unbelievable that these two things could have been found together and used together. I think it's not that interesting, really, from a toxicological perspective. It's a fascinating product as far as how we might progress with research. The people who are doing the research are doing it with independent finance. It's not coming from the government, and it's actually good science. I review for 22 peer-reviewed journals, and I'm a vicious bastard when it comes to criticizing other people's literature. But the papers that are published regarding this are good. They're methodologically sound, and they stand up to scrutiny. There are several phase 2 type trials, so looking at what they're doing to people. Certainly the safety of this product seems to be beyond question. And one of the things that I found most gratifying was that in the one reported death about this product, basically the heavies from the United States wrote a letter to utterly refute this, using good science to say that in fact it was probably 5-methoxy that killed the person who died. They did the calculations looking at the blood levels, and they put that case report to bed, because these case reports are what are frequently used, simple, isolated deaths, to legislate against product. And this is something that in Australia we need to really get our heads around, is that it's not good enough to let shabby science be published on these products, because you'll arrive at a situation where, for example, like salvinorin, as we'll talk about, is banned for no good reason. Similarly with kratom. I think it's going to be very difficult to apply traditional drug prohibition paradigms to this product. And in fact, there's even a policy of harm minimization, or ideas about harm minimization emerging. Tupper has got a paper in press about this. Lovely creature. Those of you who come from Melbourne will be delighted to hear that soon you'll be able to partake. This is the... you're not going to find me licking any toads, I tell you that right now. There's no evidence to support or refute the hypothesis that cane toads enjoy being licked. There's room for a study there, I'm sure. I would say that they probably prefer it to being smoked. And I'm not going to say a great deal about this, because there's not an awful lot known about it from a medical perspective, apart from the fact that it does contain, bufotenine itself is a glycoside. And this means that it can be toxic to the heart. You're probably aware of foxglove or digoxin. These are toxic. And if you go and lick a vast quantity of toads, you can get an arrhythmia and have problems with your heart. That is something that probably people who lick lots of toads deserve. This is a very interesting product, and also a disgrace about how it's been treated. It's consumed in a wide variety of modes. It can be smoked. You can use little resin cakes. You can use it as a tea, and it comes in a powder. And of course, I'm talking about kratom. And it's been used for centuries in Southeast Asia. It's called biak biak in Malaysia. And it's a very interesting product. It's both a mu and delta opioid receptor agonist. And I can't find a lot of literature to suggest that it's dangerous. It's banned in Thailand because people use it a lot, and it's been suggested that they're dependent upon it. But I can only find one set of cases in the Bulletin on Narcotics, which is not necessarily the most reliable production, be it that it's produced by the International Narcotic Control Bureau, 5 cases of psychosis in the world literature. So I believe that it has significant potential for treatment of opiate addiction. But of course, it was scheduled in Australia in 2004.
Is it only been found in Thailand for centuries rather than millennia?
Oh, excuse me for saying centuries. That's all. God, it could have been there since the dawn of time, for all I know. But centuries to me seems like a long time. So yeah, millennia, probably before the moon was invented. Salvia divinorum. This is something that fascinates me and angers me. It has an extensive ancient history, probably before the dawn of the universe, but with very recent knowledge as far as Western medicine is concerned. It was, first mention that I can find of it in the scientific literature is 1939. The first botanical description that I can find is 1962. And the active ingredient was isolated in 1982, but nobody knew what it was until it was identified as active principle in 1993. And that's what it looks like. It's a diterpene molecule. and it's possibly one of the most potent of the naturally occurring hallucinogens. It's a very interesting agent. It's a kappa opioid receptor agonist. And it could be so useful in actually working out what the hell the kappa opiate receptor does. And unfortunately, in Australia, it's been banned. Around the world, it's largely unregulated, but Australia was the first country to ban it in 2002. There's no really good reason. I think it was banned for the potential for dangerous use, but it doesn't cause any problems in rodents. They go through it like nothing. You know, in Italy, 11% of people who go to raves have used it. And this enormous Old Testament-sized study from, or review from Ott in 1995 found no major problems. So the actual logic behind its ban in Australia is it's non-existent.
That would be Jonathan Ott, not the musician.
There are 2 case reports of any adverse effects whatsoever in the medical literature. And the worst effect was what? Devastating sensation of déjà vu. One of the case reports also was with large quantities of marijuana consumption. So the problems associated with it could easily have been cannabis related. And that is the extent of the world literature reflecting the harm of this product. Go figure. There's widespread marketing on the internet. The other things that I can tell you, there is a report by Woolwich et al. who looked at the concentrations of salvinorin in the variously labeled, 5 times, 10 times, 10.5 million times grade, and they actually in the series that they looked at didn't actually find a lot of difference in the content of salvinorin A. I think one of the things that has been speculated upon is that it's actually not only being targeted in its own right, but I believe that those agents which are marketing it will be targeted themselves. There's growing sort of speculation that it will be used as an excuse to target entheogenic websites that are marketing it outside Australia. So I think there is a very interesting battle brewing here. And I think, it won't be with Australian scientists because most of them have laid down and died when it comes to struggling against this sort of thing. But I think internationally, it's going to be like the scheduling of MDMA. I think we're going to see a battle here. I hope so, anyway. I'm going to finish up and talk to you a little bit about you. You know about you as individuals, but I thought I might share what I know about you as a group. And I would, once again, like to thank all of you who were brave enough to answer this. I spoke to Ronnie about this, and apparently you all thought I was a cop. Yeah, I am. You're all under arrest. No, I'm not. I'm just interested in you. So those of you who were brave enough to do that, I congratulate you. Because I think we are going to be able to use the results of this survey in ways that I hope you will find useful. So who are you? Well, those of you who answered the survey, of course, are predominantly male. It seems 50-50, so what are you doing with yourselves? Women, get up and answer my survey. No transsexuals among you. What are you doing? Well, most of you are working full-time. Some of you are students. This is an important graph for me, because you're not all drawing dole. I mean, I can turn around to people when I present this data and say, well, actually, these are functional members of society. These are not down-and-out, mullet-wearing, plaid shirt lunatics, grazing on the flora and fauna of Australia. I am a lapsed Catholic, very lapsed, in fact. And so this pleased me greatly. No need for lions here. You've all moved on from Christianity on your own accord. And there's things, you are things that I've never heard of. Things like animists, and I've got to go and look up what all these things are. Fascinating. I'm glad to see one of you is a pantheist, like me. Once again, this is important to me. A lot of you are in serious relationships or in a relationship of sorts. So you're not crazy fuck monkeys, necessarily. This is important because this is how consumers are portrayed. And so this data is useful. I can turn around and say, well, actually, no, these people are exactly more or less the same spread as you and me. A lot of you are very highly educated. Certainly, the majority of you have finished secondary school, a full set of schooling. I know there's 2 of you doing postgraduate science degrees. So, once again, fairly bright. Most of you are self-taught as far as your botanical knowledge is concerned. There are people who have undergraduate degrees. There's one person who is studying for a postgraduate degree. There's another person studying for a postdoc degree. But honest enough to tell me that you hadn't completed them, and that's very gratifying. These slides are going to get a little bit more complicated, so I'll talk you through them. This is the question that I asked. Are you curious about using a given product? And the things that you're quite, oh God almighty, the things that you're quite curious about are ketamine. As you recall, those of you who answered the survey, I divided this up into the sort of synthetics and the entheogens. So this is the synthetic sort of drug side of things. Ketamine, some of you are interested in heroin, cocaine, and GHB or fantasy. Those are the ones that feature high on your mystical trip. I think this is also important. You know, none of you are really naive to drug use. You are quite experienced consumers. So this maroon bit here is, have you used it before? These are absolute numbers, they're not percentages. But you've used quite a lot of product in your time, the one exception being volatiles. And you've also, used quite a lot of things recently, obviously alcohol and cannabis and tobacco. So, you know, you're not naive to these products. Why do you use these synthetic products? Mostly the synthetics are used for recreational purposes. Some of you are using things like LSD and also mushrooms, which you get into more detail in the next section, for enlightenment. I think that's really interesting because you're not necessarily just going out and getting blitzed because you want to have fun. You're using these products for what some people might construe as slightly more responsible use. Some people are, well, hardly surprising, using painkillers, analgesics, and anxiolytics for medical purposes. Huh, of course they are. And using cannabis for relaxation, as well as alcohol. So no big surprises there. This is about harm and what you thought would be dangerous, or whether or not you were all the way down to you've been hospitalized. I just draw your attention to people who have been hospitalized. Well, not a lot of people in this group have been hospitalized. And this is exactly the same survey that we applied to the rave community in South Australia. Now, I don't know if they're particularly naughty, but a lot of people have been hospitalized through their drug use. And you appear to avoid being hospitalized. And that's fascinating. Yeah, that's the proper way to use drugs. Let me relax. Don't come to my hospital. Well, good on you for doing that. Quite a lot of you know people who have been hospitalized, particularly with alcohol. And I deliberately included this because I actually draw no distinction between those substances which are legal and those which are illegal. They're substances which change behavior and one's biochemistry. And so, you know, as far as you're concerned, alcohol and tobacco are the dangerous products. And I tend to agree with you. You don't like the sound of volatiles, and you don't like the sound of meth, despite the fact that quite a lot of you are using it. You certainly believe that they can be dangerous substances. This is a sort of an alternative breakdown here. I would never use these products in any circumstances, or red, and I'm considering or curious about using them in green. And these are the entheogens. And interestingly, it's almost 50-50 for Datura. It's one of the things that most of you would never use. But also there's a reasonable group of people who are going to be interested in using it. People are very interested in things like morning glory, ergot, ayahuasca scores highly, and so does the Ammonite species. In terms of things that you're anxious about, Datura, angel's trumpet, and of course belladonna, and that seems entirely reasonable. Same graph, except for a few more. San Pedro, nobody's concerned about using that. And that's probably a reflection of the fact that it's not a particularly dangerous thing to use. Peyote, morning glory. In terms of, I think that you're probably not interested in using that because it tastes like shit, rather than the fact that it's dangerous to you. What about how frequently you're using these products? Once again, you're not naive. A lot of you have used Hawaiian wood rose or lysergic acid amide products. This is, I think, quite interesting. A lot of you are recently using acacia species, and probably one of the things that you're using most recently. Once again, a lot of you have used guarana for what it's worth, and salvia. A lot of you have used the psilocybe species quite recently. Why are you using these products? So this is the same question would apply to the entheogens. And what is interesting to me is that with this group of products, a lot of you are using them not for recreational purposes. So a lot of you are using them more for enlightenment. So particularly things like wattle, like the Hawaiian baby wood rose, ayahuasca, and morning glory. Definitely there's a recreational interest there as well, but the sort of enlightenment use has definitely increased in the entheogens. Similarly, if you look at the psilocybe species here, definitely people are interested in using these products more for enlightenment than for recreational use. How do you get it? A lot of you are growing it yourself or harvesting it locally. So clearly, these are products that are readily available to you. And, well, they're plants, so that shouldn't necessarily be that surprising. Some of you are acquiring some of these products from international markets, betel nut, Ammonite. I guess that must be spore prints. I don't know. And similarly, a lot of you are, particularly, say, for example, with psilocybe, you're just harvesting it on your own. It's out there. Why not use it? How do you use it? Well, it depends, I guess, on the product. Cat is used in its native form. Wattle is smoked. And in some of them, you drink as an infusion, for example, with ayahuasca. This is not surprising. And similarly with the psilocybe species, you eat it in its native form. This I found very interesting. You're quite a sophisticated group of users as far as preparation is concerned. So this business of using complex, multi-step extractions requiring additional chemicals or equipment, that doesn't seem to faze you at all. Fuck it, bring it on, is what you're saying. Look at this. Yeah, bloody hell, all budding chemists, every single one of you. And similarly with the San Pedros as well. So that is very interesting. A lot of you have a lot of knowledge that you could share. These are the attitudinal questions that we included at the end. And I'll just share them with you, and you can make it of it what you will. Most of you believe that the botanical entheogens are safer than synthetic drugs. Some of you were subtle enough to say it depends. And you're absolutely right. We put it in the comment section particularly for that. Most of you strongly believe that the use of entheogens has improved your quality of life. An enormous amount of you believe that the laws restricting drug use seem to cause more problems than arise from the drugs themselves. That's probably the biggest consensus that we have of any of the questions. I find this a very interesting one because there are clearly implications for me as a doctor. Synthetic drug use is a young person's game. I can see myself using entheogens into my old age. And we're seeing this. We're seeing older people using products. And my profession is failing to acknowledge the fact that, you know, a 60-year-old can come in off tap. It happens, and I've treated them. And this is going to be the future. I think there are implications for you as a community. Unfortunately, as your body gets older, you're going to need to use other medications. And we need to really start thinking about the interaction between medicines and some of these products, because there's clearly room for danger there. This is a deliberately provocative question, and it probably had the most comments associated with it, because I deliberately included legalized and regulated together. And a lot of people had problems with the idea that entheogens should be regulated. Legalized, yes, but regulated, not so clear. To me, and I'll finish up now because it's getting late, it's getting cold, and there'll be snakes out soon. I asked you two questions, really, at the end, about what you want to know, because this is your survey. I feel that I have no possession of it. It's yours, and you can do with it what you will. I hope to share some of the results with some of my colleagues. But it's very important to me that if we do this again, that I ask you questions that you want to know. So we asked you, what do you want to know? This is a really interesting question, and it's provoked a lot of discussion on blue light recently about how this knowledge, or any knowledge that is generated by a survey, can be used against the community that's completing the survey. And that's all about trust. And hopefully we'll learn to trust each other. But it's a very valid question, and not one that I think has been raised enough about people who study these ecological niches. The relationship of growing to consumption. If you grow these products, do you consume it in a different way? Great question. What was the spark? What made you interested in the first place about using these products? What would you like to buy at your local survey or servo? Trends in usage will be something that I would be very interested in, but obviously it requires more surveys to elucidate. How does it affect your daily life? And does it have any sort of, can we measure whether it creates a greater psychological maturity? These are very sophisticated questions, and I applaud you for them. And I don't believe that there are any surveys in the world that have ever answered them. You are designing the next survey if you choose to complete it. What about shamanic practice in corporate and social systems in the Western world? What attitudes do you take when you first decide to use an entheogen for the first time? I love this question. At what point did the transition from recreational drug use to entheogenic use occur, and what catalyzed that move? A difficult question to ask, but fascinating in its own right. So that's a genius question. How does your use of entheogens manifest itself in daily life? And I think you're right. I mean, this is a baseline study, and I think further studies, if we do them, should look at the positive aspects that are associated with them. And also, in a Western context, are you using ritual, these entheogenic substances ritually? This is a depressing slide. This is from the sort of work that we've been doing. We asked people, and I didn't ask you because I didn't want to load you with any more information because you're clearly struggling. There was a huge fall off towards the end of the survey. You're falling asleep or getting bored. But this is pretty representative. Dare I say it would be representative in your community as well. Who do you trust for your information on drugs? Rave safety, sort of peer groups are trusted first and foremost. Yeah, and they do a good job. I strongly support what they do. Fucking GPs beat us, and that pisses me off no end. Best mates, sibling, health workers, circle of friends, parents, supplier, police. This is South Australia, so I suspect it would be different in New South Wales. But in South Australia, the police are not complete muppets, which is quite interesting for law enforcement. But if you look down here, this is a disgrace. Yeah, absolutely. Out of everybody, if I'm trying to get information to people about, there's something that could hurt you, so please don't use it. I can't get it to you through TV and newspaper because you just don't fucking believe a word that they're saying.
But the federal government's more trusted than the TV.
Well, I beg your pardon, yes, if you can read it. So down here, we've got police about midway here, websites, somebody I know, teachers. I think teachers are probably not trusted not because they're not deemed to be trustworthy people, but it's perceived that they don't know a lot about these things. Radio, and I think the radio is here before all the other media outlets, because largely due, I think, to probably Steve Kinane and his hack program, which has tackled the issue quite aggressively. But this is disgraceful in Australia, that the agencies of health and the agencies of information should be so far down here. There is no dialogue between any of the drug-consuming communities in Australia and the agencies that are there to protect them from coming to harm. It's a disgrace. $22 million a year on ad campaigns and nobody's listening. What about drugs policy for entheogens? Well, there's really very limited experience. A lot that shows any variance from the zero tolerance experience is in Holland. The Germans have created a toxicity index of plants that perhaps shouldn't grow in primary schools, and there's an effort to create a national labeling system in Australia, but that's about it. And the thing that moved me, I actually moved me, and I'm a man rarely moved, was the moderation and restraint that this community, certainly those who answered this survey, shows in how they use these products. They do a lot of research. They use a sitter. A lot of attention to set and setting. They limit their doses. They use safety goggles. I haven't cross-referenced it. One or two people actually filled this out under the influence, and I wonder whether or not this might have been one of them. One that I didn't include there was they actually write down on a piece of paper what they've taken in case something bad happens. And this, I think, is a level of moderation and restraint that could serve as an example to everyone who consumes product in this country. And I think you have an enormous opportunity to share this restraint and moderation to other groups of users. One of the things I would love to do is to get this sense of moderation brought into formal drugs policy, remove any sort of hint of abstention, of prohibition, and bring your concept of moderation. Because we've seen, you guys aren't getting hurt. And if we can bring that to the larger drugs policy forum at large, we can stop the 12-year-old muppets who waste my time from getting hurt. And they will listen to you far more than they'll listen to me or than they'll listen to anyone else, because you are experienced. These are, I don't know if this works. I was told that if I wasn't having a fun trip on my mushrooms in Amsterdam, I would just have to take these or eat chocolate. I suspect it's a marketing ploy. But I was so interested, I bought if somebody can tell me how chocolate reverses psilocybin, I'll buy them a pint. But they're quite strict. They're quite restrained. They do try very hard. I was there last May, and I chatted to a lot of people about how they sell their mushrooms and who they sell them to. And unfortunately, the ban on mushroom sales in Holland, it's got nothing to do with the regular users. It's to do with fucking British people, frankly, going over there, getting drunk and using mushrooms and cutting themselves or hurting themselves. And unfortunately, that sort of behavior is used as an excuse to legislate against everybody. So, to finish up, what sort of things are we potentially looking at in the near future? I hope that we're about to see a return to what I'm describing as a psycho-heuristic era. An era where we're going to use these substances to learn a great deal more about the human mind. And I think if that happens, you are going to be in the vanguard of that, because nobody knows as much about these substances as you do. And it's really up to you as to whether or not you want to make a scientific contribution to this. I think it's up to the medical and the science community to help you make this contribution if it's something you want to do, and to open doors and get you a seat at the table. I think there are interesting new legal horizons. Salvia, kratom, cannabis. It's our intention to work very hard in the next few years to look at medicinal use of cannabis and also medicinal use of MDMA. And I think, although you may insist on your rights to use these products recreationally, I think one of the ways that will increase the acceptability of these products is if it is concomitantly shown that they have medical benefit as well. What about patterns of use? It concerns me that young people are getting into some of these products which I believe are really for the connoisseur, if you like. People who are experienced. I think a lot of these new compounds that we're so scared of in the medical profession are quite intimidating, and if used inappropriately, can be quite psychically damaging. I think younger users are less experienced. They have little to no sense of moderation, and they often use product in the same way as they drink beer. 14 to 16-year-old people. I think that's quite young to be using these things. The Norwegians have been doing PET scans on teenagers and quite clearly proven that they're hardly human. That they should be controlled like puppies with bungee cords and muzzles until they prove their adulthood. They're basically, functional PET scan shows that their neural nets and their synapses are not formed like adults. And it's dangerous. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing everybody going hard on cannabis at the moment is because younger people are using them, and it's causing damage to younger people. It's also to do with strength of cannabis and the like. But I think that we need to get away from the fact that a lot of these products could be used in a free-for-all way. I think I happen to be edging towards the moderate Enlightenment path of use, because that's the way they've always been used as by human beings. And I put it to you that the more young people who get hurt, particularly young people, by these products, the more likely it is that the whole product and the whole community will be tainted by those sort of... Newspapers love this shit. 14-year-old killed by new hallucinogenic drug. I know the advertiser would go bunter to get that on the front page. And I think you guys have an incredibly important role to continue what you're doing and basically to be shaman for drug users around Australia, to teach and preach moderation and to demonstrate that if people use these substances in moderation, they can be used quite safely and indeed can be very beneficial to the community at large. Finally, maybe Mother Nature will take its own turn. There's very good evidence to suggest that climate change is changing the composition of the products that you and I might be interested in consuming. And maybe, in fact, Mother Nature is so pissed off with us that it'll in fact just kill us all off. Naughty little monkeys, you've fucked up one too many times. Let's hope that we can, get back to a place where the products that Gaia provides us with are in fact less toxic and not more toxic. Thank you so much for all your time. Go home to your beds. Go on.